Hey guys, I'm Will from Tested.
And I'm Norm from Tested.
Norm, over the last couple of weeks, we have been kind of testing something that we've had a little, just the teensiest bit of experience with.
We want to get more experience with high-speed photography, high-speed cameras.
Yeah, it's neat. It's a fun thing to go out and play around with, and it gives us an opportunity to try stuff that we wouldn't normally do on a day-to-day basis.
And I think it's something that's becoming way more relevant these days because we have a lot of these consumer cameras that have high-speed functionality.
You mean like my iPhone 5S, which can shoot 120 frames per second?
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So for the longest time, high-speed video was put out of the hands of consumers. Most cameras, if you bought them, like even photography cameras that can shoot video, shot at 30 FPS.
Or 24. There were a handful of like flash-based handy cams that use CMOS sensors as long ago as 8 or 10 years ago that you could shoot faster than 24 or 30 frames per second with. But it was unusual and the quality was usually not very good. And as soon as you got up to 120 frames per second or more, you got down to like postage stamp style web video. So they weren't that great.
But I think that this year, and we've seen last year, we've seen a rise in cameras that, and consumer cameras that are both dedicated high-speed cameras or just phones, smartphones, and regular cameras that can now shoot at higher frame rates. And there are a couple of reasons for that.
Yeah.
And to understand that, I think we need to talk about what makes a high-speed camera, and what those limitations are.
Well, they slow down time, right?
That's ostensibly what they do. They make everything go, they matrixize the world.
It's so when someone punches Robert Downey Jr. in one of the Sherlock Holmes movies, everything slows down, they do matrix moves, and then you see the guy's jaw ripple. Yeah. What they're doing is they're shooting at a much higher speed than normal. The reason we call them high-speed cameras is that instead of rolling the virtual equivalent of a piece of film through the shutter every 30 seconds, it runs them through every 60 or 120 or 240 or even up to millions of frames a second in some cases.
It's a really good analogy because back in the old day, when people talk about cranking up the speed of film and they're using analog film, they were actually cranking up the film reel faster through that lens.
If you've watched Hugo, you've seen it happen. In the old days, a guy actually turned a crank on the side of the camera, and the stability of that image, of this frame rate of the image, was dependent on him being able to crank it at a consistent speed. It was a high-skill job, even though it sounds kind of dumb now.
And just like that has analogies to digital film, digital cameras, the same thing applies for recording video. So on a modern digital video camera, there are a couple factors that tie into how fast that camera can record.
It all works together, just like anything else. Yep. It's an integrated system. So you have things, just like a normal film camera, they have a sensor sensitivity, the ISO equivalent. You have the aperture setting on the lens, the shutters, and all that stuff. But the interesting place comes in the comparison between the resolution that you shoot at and the frame rate that you can shoot at, the speed that you can shoot at.
Frame rate is the biggest thing. And in terms of what the frame rate actually means, that's how many times the camera, your physical camera, whether it's a GoPro, whether it's your iPhone, can save frames onto the memory.
Record each frame. So you measure that in frames per second. Some people call that hertz because you're talking about the number of cycles or frames recorded in each second.
And that's a factor of the sensor size saving the memory.
It's the whole system. It's a factor of the sensor size. It's a factor of the storage subsystem. It's a factor of the processor that's usually embedded on the sensor these days. And there are different tricks that different kinds of cameras can use. Some of the higher end cameras actually use different like strobe pixels on the sensor, strobe lines on the sensor. So if you're shooting at 800 frames a second, one block of pixels will shoot, each one in that 8 will shoot 100 times a second instead of having every pixel on the sensor shoot 800. That's essentially, it's kind of complex, but that's why you end up with a loss in resolution a lot of times to get higher frame rates.
So like if you imagine a sensor as a grid,
like
for example, a 1080p sensor, it's saving 1920 pixels wide and 1080 pixels tall. The processor and the memory buffer can save, for example, 24 frames per second of that grid of how many megapixel that is. But if you reduce the number of pixels, if you want to, for example, shoot every other pixel or every other line, then that's less taxing on the memory or less taxing on the processor, and so it can save 60 of those frames.
It's doing the same amount of work, but just spread over a great many more frames. One of the things that changes the way different cameras handle this is how they arrange that division of labor. Some do lines. I think the FS700 does lines, right? Some of the high-end Phantoms, like they use to shoot movies, and like the slow-mo guys use, actually have kind of these blocks of pixels that they then strobe within. And so you end up with different. It skews the image in different ways. Some of them end up squinched up, and you have to stretch them out and interpolate between. Some of them end up just like square or whatever. There's all sorts of weird stuff. You can get into really crazy details. If you just want to shoot some high-speed video, you don't probably need to know a lot about that stuff.
But the other factor that I think you do need to know about is the shutter speed. And that is different from the sensor storing the image to the camera. This is how much light is actually being let in to each of those little pixels.
But it's not a mechanical shutter, right?
It's not like something closing and opening. It's just the sensor saying, I'm going to let in light for 1/1000th of a second or 1/4000th of a second and save that much light.
It was light, it was dark, it was light, it was dark, it was light, it was dark. So then you have an electronic shutter on the sensor. You typically, in our experience at least, you want to set that at some multiple above the speed that you're recording the video, right? Because the faster the shutter, just like with a film camera, the more crisp each image is going to be. Right.
So for example, even though your sensor can, for example, save frame rate at 120 frames per second, if your shutter is still moving at just opening and closing at a maximum of 1/160th of a second, it's going to be blurry or you're going to get dark images. The shutter needs to be faster than the frame.
Yeah, exactly. You want to have you want to have the frame open longer than longer than the shutter is open.
Right.
We're making this much more complex than it needs to be.
The way the shutter system works between different image sensors can also differ. So depending if you're using a CCD sensor or a CMOS sensor, some CMOS sensors, the shutter works linearly. So it tells each pixel from top to bottom, open, close, open, close. But when you save at higher frame rates, then you get what's called the rolling shutter effect. So fast-moving objects look distorted because light is coming in at actually different times in that interval.
It almost looks so that's when you have a thing where it looks like the image gets squinched from line to line, right?
And a perfect example of that is if you try to take a picture or shoot a video of a plane propeller and you see it look warped or like split apart, and that's because it's using a rolling shutter. Okay. So for high-end or even prosumer high-speed cameras, they all use the global shutters, which means the electronic shutters across all the pixels open and close at the same time.
Okay.
So that's frame rate and shutter. Other things to consider when shooting high-speed video, lighting is of course very important.
You need a ton more light. Even when we shoot outside with the basic high-speed cameras, we bring the big giant spotlights just like we use on the set. Yeah. Reflectors, all that kind of stuff helps. The more light you can get onto something, the higher speed you can shoot at.
And it's analogous to shooting a still photo with digital camera. If you're shooting at a higher shutter, you're opening and closing that pixel for so long, and the faster you open and close it, it means the less actual physical photons get in.
And if you're shooting at 1/4000th of a second for a still photo or high speed, it's the same amount of time, the same amount of light gets in. To that effect, you can also adjust the ISO on most of these cameras. Yes. Obviously not on the low end. The iPhone does that for you automatically. I think the GoPro does the same. But as soon as you move above those kind of levels, then you're looking at being able to adjust that stuff manually.
And so in our experience, we've shot mostly outdoors with very bright sunlight plus some other light.
That's the easiest way to make sure you have enough light.
And indoors, you can also run a risk if you're shooting at a high enough frame rate that you can actually catch the strobing in the light. So the light has its own flicker refresh rate. And so if you're using just a regular cheap fluorescent light, you're going to see some of that flicker.
You're going to see a 60 hertz cycle. Because you can avoid that by running the shutter at a multiple of 60 is my understanding. So anyway.
And then another factor that ties into the function of a high-speed camera is the memory, the idea of how much memory. Because when you're saving something at, for example, 120 frames per second, you're storing many more frames in that 1 second or in however long you shoot than if you're shooting at 30 FPS.
So 1 second of real time is equivalent to 4 seconds of footage at 120 frames per second.
And so you need 4 times as much memory, not just in the final storage, but in the memory buffer, in where the camera temporarily stores that raw image before it processes it, compresses it, and saves it as a video file.
Right. Most cameras, especially cameras that are designed for shooting regular, real life stuff, not high speed, are designed to shoot at 24, 30, 60 frames per second. So the buffers are designed to allow that. What happens with most of the cameras when you shoot high speed is you either have a limited amount of time that you can shoot, and then the buffer fills up and it stops recording, or you have to. Actually, that's it.
Right.
I mean, some things like the iPhone will shoot high speed kind of indefinitely. It seems like it stops at about 5 minutes usually, but that could be because of overheating or something. Like, it's unclear why that stops.
And so what the memory also allows is for this idea of an end trigger, or as opposed to a pre-trigger. With the iPhone, it technically is always a pre-trigger.
Yeah.
When you press the button, it's going to record at your 120 frames per second in as long as 5 minutes. But with some cameras, if you want to capture an action you don't know when that action is going to happen, if it's a little unpredictable, like the popping of a balloon, for example, you can set high-end cameras to record after the fact. And it'll be recording nonstop, and it'll say, save, for example, the last 8 seconds or 4 seconds of this footage.
Most of the high-end cameras, so what that means is it's always recording, and then it only saves the last few seconds. Most of the cameras let you set either way. The thing we found is that the faster and more unpredictable something is, the more important that post-trigger is. If you're shooting your dog shaking, you're probably okay with a start trigger on your iPhone or whatever.
Absolutely. So in terms of using high-speed photography and high-speed video, there's 2 fundamental ways to think about how you're using this video. When we're talking about consumer high-speed cameras, like the iPhone or the GoPro, where you're shooting at 120 or 240 FPS, we're thinking about slowing down time. Like you said, 1/4 normal time.
For the iPhone.
Or 1/8 normal time at 240 FPS. Higher than that, when you go to 480, 960, or even many thousands frames per second, then we're talking about what you can capture in 1 frame of that high-speed video.
And a lot of that, so at 120 and 240 frames per second, put it another way, you're slowing down things that you can perceive as a human being.
Yeah.
So even up to 480, it's things that you see. You might see at 480 frames per second some novel things happening that are too fast for you to capture. For example, if somebody slaps you in the face, you'll see the kind of ripples move across as their skin deforms around the impact. But you're still going to see things that happen at human speed. Once you speed up beyond that and go into thousands of frames per second and millions of frames per second even, you can see things that happen like incredibly fast physical and chemical reactions, things that are bullets flying by as if they were just moving incredibly slowly, things that you can't see on a human scale.
And it's
those are the 2 different things, and they're 2 different markets. Like, there's scientific cameras, and then there's cameras for people to noodle around with and make awesome videos on the internet and stuff like that. They're 2 different things.
It's really less useful to think about those high-end cameras as, for example, saying it's 1,000 times slower than reality.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean anything. But when you say something like, oh, you can capture in 1 frame something that happens in 0.0008 of a second.
Hold on, just 0, 0,
0,
0, 2 zeros,
2
not
zeros,
3. Yeah.
0.008 of a second. Yeah. That matters more because you're talking about a reaction.
Right. So when you're talking about, let's see, a 120 frames per second, you're talking about each frame being about 8 thousandths of a second. As you go up, when you're talking about a 1200 frame per second camera, that's now 8 10,000ths. It's so you like you said, you can see things that happen very, very quickly.
So we've used recently in the past few weeks 4 high-speed cameras. We shot some videos, which I think you can watch online right now. They're really cool. I would recommend you watch those online, of shattering some glass and detonating an airbag. And we shot all of those with 4 consumer and prosumer high-speed cameras, not the scientific high-speed cameras, not the Vision Tech Phantoms. Those are out of our price range and out of most people's price range.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at an entry-level Phantom, which is, again, what they used to shoot like those Sherlock Holmes movies and a lot of the cinematic high-speed that you see, those cameras start at $25,000 or $30,000. They're purely high-speed cameras. You can't use them for other stuff. And they're suitable for film work. They're suitable for some science work, but probably not for like day-to-day use for somebody like us.
So,
let's run down the list. So the first thing we did is iPhone 5. This is the 5S, rather. It shoots 720p at 120 frames per second. Like I said a minute ago, that's about 4 thousandths of a frame Each frame capture is about 0.004 of a second long. You can adjust the shutter speed and the iris and stuff like that automatically. You do the same thing with it you do with any other camera app on a phone. You tap the part that you want to be in focus and exposed properly, and then hope it works itself out from there.
And one of the great things about the iPhone is that user experience is pretty seamless. There's not a lot of user tweaking, like processing in terms of the frame rate that you want to do. It shoots that 120 FPS at 720p, so there you go. It's reducing the resolution, so it can save in real time, and it doesn't have any of that saving to buffer time.
You don't, yeah, it works just like a normal camera would work, like you'd expect the normal video camera to work. There's some weird stuff with processing the video that comes out of it. When you export the video and take it off of the device, you have to then go in and adjust the way the speed timing works. The best thing I've found is just to, in the viewer, you can stretch out the part where the high speed starts and stops. So by default, it gives you a few seconds of normal speed, then it does the slowdown. And the best thing to do when you're exporting, if you want to edit that footage, is to just export the whole thing as a separate clip in the high speed. And then you can import that and do what you want with it in Final Cut or Premiere or whatever your video editor of choice is. It also does audio, which is unique.
It's kind of weird.
I don't understand exactly what's happening when it does the audio, but it does a convincing job. The audio and the video stay in sync very well, and you end up hearing, everybody sounds like their Jabba the Hutt, basically.
Yep, just like that.
And, it's like my dad always said that the best high-speed camera you have is the one that's in your pocket. So this is the only one that fits in my pocket that I have. So.
And the one that you can review back immediately.
Yeah, it's like, when we were testing 4 different cameras, the thing that we found is that, with especially some of the higher-end, faster cameras, there's a fairly long 5 or 10 minute period where you're processing video, exporting it, saving it, copying it to the laptop, whatever. With the iPhone, you can see immediately, and 4 times faster, 4 times slower than normal. Turns out pretty good. You can get an idea of whether your stuff worked or didn't work with that.
Yeah, it's good for things like, for example, blowing raspberries.
Yeah, human scale stuff. Again, 120 frames per second, 240 frames per second, kind of 480 frames per second are good for slowing down things that you can already see and that you can see happen in the real world, just making them look cool. If it's snowing outside, I unfortunately lost the video when my phone broke, but I was in Tahoe, it was snowing, you get the snowflakes coming down, and they look like they're not stopped, but they're just going very, very slowly. It's very pretty. Rain's really cool. The dog shaking when she's wet, the baby blowing raspberries. Like, it's an opportunity, it's another tool in your toolbox to make silly home videos, basically.
And as we alluded to, here's the footage also of the iPhone recording the airbag detonating.
Yeah.
It's not very spectacular. It still happens too fast for the iPhone.
Well, you can see things happening faster than you could with the human eye. Like, if you play this real speed and then you play it at the iPhone speed, you can see more, but you lose a lot of the detail of the bag slowly unfolding out of the thing. You see it inflate, you see it bounce up in the air, and you see it crash down. Fast enough to see details, but not to see the really neat details.
Right. So the next camera I want to talk about is the GoPro, and it's right in front of me here.
This is the HD Hero 3, right?
Hero 3 Black Edition, which is the only one that has the processor. And so
the default Hero 3s don't do high speed. Yep. It's only the 4K compatible Black Edition. Okay.
And that's a function, of course, of the sensor and also the processor.
Right.
So it does, just like the iPhone, it does 120 frames per second at 720p. So technically, should be the same effect as the iPhone. But I think the GoPro actually does better image quality, has a better image sensor. So the video quality is, I think, better than the iPhone.
Well, they also have the GoPro lens on it, so you have a really wide angle. Is the high speed the wide FOV, or is it the cropped in one?
It's a wide FOV.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're going to get a neat fisheye. You can put it right up close to something. You'll see a big everything that's happening around it.
And so you do have very limited options when it comes to focal length or your live view ability. You don't know how your frame looks like unless you tether it to a phone, for example, and that's a drain on battery life.
Yeah, being able to review is really handy because a lot of times if things are happening faster than you can actually see, you're not going to know if you got what you needed until you actually watch the video. And with this thing, you have to take it out of the case, put the card in. When you plug the card into the laptop, it's going to play at 30 frames per second. So you actually have to run it through their software and convert the file into something that you can then import into Final Cut or whatever. I think After Effects can deal with it natively, but most stuff can't.
And GoPro does include software for you to adjust that frame rate. But when you plug that in, you don't see the slow motion. It looks like a regular 30 FPS recorded
normal
30 FPS
video.
Yeah. So the GoPro, I think it's great for like covered shots as a second camera, like a second angle, and which is exactly what we used it for our tests.
Again, neither of the cameras we've talked about so far are primarily high-speed cameras. It's just an added bonus feature that came, I assume, because once the sensors reach a certain capability and the storage reach a certain capability, it's free to add, so they tack it on.
Yeah. It's like feature creep.
Now, the next guy on the list is the Sony FS700. This is the camera we used last summer when we went in my backyard and did a lot of dumb stuff on a high-speed video. And
ostensibly also not a dedicated high-speed camera. This is a real production camera.
This is a camera people use to shoot TV shows and business.
Absolutely. Yeah. But when we were at NAB last year, that's the National Association of Broadcasters big convention where they show off new cameras, Sony really wanted to emphasize the high-speed functionality of this camera because it has that processing capability. It can crank up the shutter speed, electronic shutter. So why not? Why not have the feature in?
And you actually, as I've been watching, whether it's reality TV or scripted stuff, you start to see on TV some moderate speed, high speed footage dropping into normal TV shows. Whether it's somebody chopping something on Top Chef or whatever, these cameras are in production. People are actually using them for that stuff.
And also because it has a lot of memory and a big buffer, this is the first camera that we're talking about that can do a post trigger. So you can activate it so you press the record button and it actually saves the previous several seconds
usually
of real time.
5 or 10, whatever you configure, right?
And extrapolates that into high speed.
Now there's a problem with the post trigger. You can't jump the gun. If you press the button, if you hear the loud noise and you press the button before what's done is done, you won't see anything after you press that button.
Right, and that's because the Sony FS700 doesn't have a mid trigger, and high-end professional high-speed cameras actually have a mid trigger. It'll let you save 4 seconds before I press the button and 1 second or 2 seconds after.
That would be really handy.
That would have been really handy with this camera. So this one technically does 240 FPS at your full 1080p. That's great. 1080p, 240 FPS. Now you would think that means logically, double the frame rate, 480 frames per second, maybe that's 720p. But that's not what this does. It does something interesting because the way it cuts the pixels, like we were talking about at the very beginning, and the way it can increase that processing time, it does interlacing, so it doesn't actually save a 720p file. It still saves a 1080p file, but it's an interlaced file.
So it does every other line, every other frame? Is that the way it works? Or is it doing multiple?
Every other line, every other frame. So what you're getting is a 1920 1080p interlace file at 480 frames per second, but it doesn't look nearly as good as a 1080p file you get.
So does that mean you have if things are moving horizontally, you see a comb filter kind of effect?
You see definitely the comb filter effect. Now, last year when we shot some high-speed footage at both 480 and 960 frames per second, the 480 footage actually looks good.
What's the resolution at 480p?
It's still
at 40 frames per second, rather?
At 480 frames per second, it's 1920 by 430. So 430 and then multiplied out to 1080.
Okay.
And at 960 FPS, it's actually 1920 by 216 multiplied out. So you're only getting real 216 lines of resolution, but then multiplied 4 times out to 1080.
So if you want to see the native on this, what you do is load it up into Premiere or Final Cut or whatever, and squinch it down so the vertical resolution is correct and the aspect ratio is correct, and then you get something roughly analog to the native resolution.
Roughly, right? I think the interlacing, the software does a fairly good job, and that's why the 480 FPS resolution video actually looked good. So reviewing, for example, last year when we were shooting, for example, the pudding cup, hitting a pudding cup with a baseball bat, that was actually shot at 960 FPS. And while it's not something I would want to put on TV, it's something that's perfect for putting on YouTube.
It looks like 2008 era YouTube video.
Yeah. It looks like VHS scaled up.
It doesn't look great.
but it's also 960 FPS.
So what's the catch?
The catch is it's a $10,000 camera.
That's an expensive camera.
That really is. And I wouldn't recommend that anyone buy this camera just for high speed. There's no reason.
I think that's fairly safe to say.
I mean, Sony is selling this as a production camera. It's for use as like a B camera on TV shows. For example, Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown. When Adam and Jamie shot their special, Dangerous Toys, it was shot partly with this camera.
Okay.
And if you have nice production cameras, if you have a mixture of GoPros, and you have this camera also to shoot some 240, some 480, some 960, it can complement that footage.
But this camera, like the ability to shoot 4K, like these are things that Sony put into this camera to make it more attractive to people that are already buying $10,000 cameras versus the competitors, not to try and draw somebody in to spend $10K on what is kind of a crappy high-speed camera.
Absolutely, which is why our experience, I mean, again, we didn't have a great experience with this as a purely high-speed camera. We shouldn't be doing any scientific analysis.
We shouldn't be doing any scientific analysis, period. Yeah,
period.
No.
But especially not with this camera as our high-speed camera. So that leads us to the latest high-speed camera we've been using and testing, and this is a really interesting product. It's called the Edgertronic. It launched as a Kickstarter, and it's a $5,000 dedicated high-speed camera.
It looks like a box with a lens hole in the front.
And that's because that's basically what it is. It doesn't try to be an ergonomic. You're not going to hold this like even a photo camera or a video camera. It is a sensor on the inside, roughly APS-C size sensor, and then has a mount here for a lens, and there's a PCB on the inside with some electronics, memory, and then some input-output options in the back, and that's it.
Does it not have a flash slot?
It has.
Oh, it has a SD card slot over there. Okay,
right there, 2 SD card slots, and that's actually how it stores video. It's a very interesting device because the people who made this wanted to see what was the cheapest good high-speed camera they could make without getting into the $20,000 Phantom range.
Right.
And so all the lessons we've talked about earlier kind of boil down into how we use this camera. At the beginning, we talked about sensor size, right? You have a sensor and having an electronic global shutter, something where all the pixels can open and close at the same time. That is something they wanted to put in this camera. So they looked at China, they found a supplier, and they found a sensor that had a global shutter, and it actually has a resolution of 1280 by 1024.
So it's kind of a 12 by 10 aspect ratio or something, like 16 by 10 or something.
Not even 16 by 10. It's more like a square.
Okay.
And if you do the math, that means it's not a 1080p camera.
No, it's a 720p at most.
At most. Yeah. It's a 1280 by 1024 square at most, little rectangle at most, but there's no possible way this camera shoots 1080p because there just aren't enough pixels on there. But that was an intentional decision for cost.
This was a product of a Kickstarter, and so they came up with the idea, they figured out what they could sell it for, and then they priced it at what, around $5,000 for Kickstarter users? Yeah.
Right. And then, as we talked about decreasing resolution to increase the frame rate, this has a pretty linear path. So
unlike the Sony, where you have a big jump from 1080p to 720p
or to
480p,
weird,
WVGA, whatever.
This basically, as the pixels crop down and it's using and it's storing faster frame rate, you get basically a linear decrease. So what you have is you can shoot at 720p, it's 1280 by 720, and you get about 700 FPS.
That's really fast for that resolution.
Yeah. And as you crop down smaller, you can crop all the way down to 196 by 96 pixels, which is 192 by 96 pixels, which is tiny.
It's a postage stamp.
Postage stamp, but you get 17,900 frames per second with that.
That's a lot of frames.
Which is a lot. And so when we went at this, what we wanted to see was, what did video look like when you shoot at that 17,000 FPS and stretch it up? Can that play on YouTube and look okay? Can you make out details? And where are the sweet spots? For example, if at 720p you're getting 700 FPS, if we wanted to get 1,000 FPS, what's a good resolution? If we want to put something on YouTube or Vimeo and put something at 360p, 640 by 360, what's the fastest FPS we should get there? And what's a good thing that we can capture at that frame rate?
So at 17,000 frames per second, it's around 600 thousandths of a second per frame. Like that's the amount of time the frame is going to be open. That's crazy.
That's the type of
insanely
reaction.
fast.
And what we found is that's not even fast enough for some of the things that we would want to catch in high speed. That's not going to get, for example, many frames of a balloon exploding.
Like the classic high speed of somebody walking up to a balloon that's inflated, poking it with a pin, and watching the tear expand slowly out. You need to be faster than that.
That's why for that we'd want to put in some type of like fluid inside the balloon, whether it's gas, something in a fluid state, so it holds its shape and then dissipates. And if a water balloon, that's going to look great at your 17,000.
But a water balloon looks pretty good at like 350, 480, 240 frames per second too.
Right. Yeah, because it kind of holds its shape.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing with this is that it has no viewfinder in the back. The way you interface with this is actually through your Ethernet port.
So you plug it into a computer with Ethernet, and it assigns an IP address and serves as a host. Absolutely. And then you have some client software on the PC side.
It's actually just a web browser.
Okay.
So you plug this into your PC or Mac. You open Chrome and you load up their IP, and you get the interface. And from there, you actually do get a live view to see what your frame is like. You can adjust your frame rate settings there. This actually uses the Nikon F mount.
Okay.
It includes this 50mm lens.
But it's just a mechanical mount, right?
It's just a mechanical mount, and that means that you have all your aperture settings. You have to have it on the lens.
So you have to have a lens that uses aperture settings, which means AI, AIS, or I can't remember what the newer model line is, but basically old lenses, not modern, not the more modern lenses.
Right, or looking for specific lenses, off-party lenses that have third-party lenses that have physical aperture.
A lot of lenses designed for shooting movies have manual stuff still, because you like to control that stuff manually and not have it change.
And there's about a 2x crop when you're talking about the focal length used with this mount and the sensor.
So is this a camera that's for? It seems like it's more for people who want to do science stuff than for people who want to make internet videos, right?
Yeah, I think it's definitely not for people who want the immediacy of even something like a GoPro, where you can set it up, press a button, record, and then get dozens of shots in an hour. This takes a little time.
Pulling focus on this was a pretty significant challenge,
right?
Just because of the lag between the video coming into the sensor and being displayed on the laptop screen. You had to just move in tiny incremental steps until everything was right, and then go on about setting up the rest of your shot. There's
a lot of tinkering involved. Now, to be fair, there's also some cool stuff you can do with this camera, because there is your mid trigger, there's your end trigger, and it does include your normal physical trigger button. You plug this in, and then you can have some event happen, your balloon popping, press the button, and it will save up to 8 seconds of buffer, which that's a long time.
That's good, yeah.
And the biggest gate to this is that it actually is just the writing to video time. In the back, as you saw earlier, it has an SD card. It actually saves onto this normal SD card. There's no HDMI out, there's no SDI out, which, for example, the Sony camera has. It writes this SD card, writes its metadata file, and then you put this in your laptop and you review the footage before getting your second shot.
But hold on, you can't pipe the high speed out of the HDMI out or the SDI out until after it's been processed on the Sony either. Yeah. So it's not like that's a difference.
It's a production camera.
Yeah, that's for use in studios. This is a different thing. The thing that we found with the Sony is that it usually takes about the length of time that it would take to view the completed video. So if you're talking about a 240 frame per second video that's 8 times slower, if you record a second of footage, it takes 10 seconds, 8 or 10 seconds to view the footage. When you're talking about 20 seconds or 30 seconds, then it can take a few minutes. This seems to be even slower than that.
It's about the same. It's about 30 FPS encoding time with H.264. And it's about 20 megabits variable bit rate, which is, it's a good bit rate.
It's a high bit rate.
It's a high bit rate, which I don't think matters as much with this resolution camera, because if we were shooting at something at 640 by 352 pixels, having that 20 megabit bit rate is going to be more detailed than you need anyway.
So what format does it spit out?
MP4.
Oh, just H.264 MP4. So you can put that into anything and it'll just work.
Yeah, put in anything, it just works. And then, so we tested this at different resolutions, different frame rates. The best image quality we found was, of course, your 1280 by 720, your 720p, and that's 700 FPS. And we found that was really good for, your raspberries, blowing raspberries. Yep, doing that. It was actually really cool for, Joey did some coffee grinding, showing what it looks like when coffee goes through a grinder.
He is the kind of grinder you're not supposed to use, the blade grinder, but you can see through the top of it. When you hit the button, you can watch the coffee start to bounce around and then slowly get chunked up into bits. It's a really neat clip.
And that's one of the benefits of this is because it has that really fast global shutter. You can amp that shutter real high and get basically no blur.
Or very little blur.
Very little blur with your video, and so you can actually see everything moving. It's not very stylistic for your slow motion action shots, but it works really well when you want to capture all the details.
Now, but because it doesn't have a viewfinder and the focusing aiming process is manual and a little bit clunky, as well as even like selecting the resolution and selecting the frame rate and stuff like that, requires a little bit of math and some figuring stuff out on the back end. Probably not the kind of thing you're going to use to shoot a kid or a dog or whatever.
No.
Nothing that moves would be my advice.
Right. It's when you have an established setup with your lighting, having this on a tripod. There are 2 tripod mounts. You have one on the top here, one on here, and that's what makes this more of like a lab camera or a fixed setup camera.
This is a thing that you point at a set up in the corner of your lab. When you need to shoot something high speed, you take it over there. The focus is already pulled. The lighting's established. You just turn it on, set up your reaction, hit the button, and go.
Controlled situations.
Yeah, controlled circumstances.
We found the sweet spot with this was really at the 2,500 frames per second. That meant using 2,500 FPS, about a 1/5,000th of a second shutter.
It's 1/100th the speed of normal life, basically.
And that resolution's about 640 by 352. Close enough that I'll call it 360p.
Okay.
If you watch YouTube video, you'll be familiar. 360p is like the default viewing resolution for YouTube.
And then the neat thing about 2,500 frames per second is it's well beyond what you can perceive.
Yeah.
For example, when you pour 2 liquids into each other, you don't know that this happens because you can't see it, but the initial impact makes a hole of the falling liquid, makes a hole in the liquid it hits, and then that hole keeps drilling down further and further if you can pour well. It opens up a world of possibility, a world of things that you can't perceive normally. What is it Adam says? It's like a telescope for time?
Microscope.
Microscope for time.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, kind of. It's also a telescope because there's that crop factor. Anyway, it's a lens. It's a lens for time.
Yeah.
But when you crank it higher than 2,500 FPS, when you get to the really slow 10,000 FPS, 17,000 FPS.
That's like bullet time. That's catching bullets going by and stuff like that. Is what you're talking about.
I don't think it can't catch a bullet going by. Okay. It can barely catch a balloon popping. You get maybe 2 frames of a balloon tearing. But the surprising thing is, I think that video actually you can study it. I'm not going to say usable for web, but you can analyze the footage. You can pull up a 192 by 96 pixel video, stretch it out.
You can see enough detail. It's like watching porn that's cable scrambled. You can get what you need from it.
You get science porn.
Yeah, exactly.
It's scrambled science porn is what this camera is pretty good at. And once again, with our sweet spot, you can watch video right now of the airbag detonating at 2,500 FPS, which is spectacular.
Yeah, this is the difference between this and the iPhone is the iPhone, you see the bag inflate, it flies up, and then it crashes back down. With the 2,500 frames per second, you see the flaps of the airbag open. You see the red stuff come out of the airbag as the explosive ignites. You see the bag just unfurl really slowly, and it looks like it's pouring out of the center. It's really, really neat.
Yeah. So that's basically it. I mean, I think $5,000 for it's still cheaper than the Phantom, and for a lot of people in labs, in academic institutions, it's going to make sense.
And the Phantom isn't the end-all, be-all of high speed. No. If you're looking at scientific high speed, it's a completely different market. There are cameras more like this that don't have viewfinders and don't have common standard lens mounts that just use like an old Nikon manual mount. The thing just to be clear, I don't think we think anybody's going to go out and buy a $5,000 high-speed camera
for home
use. Yeah,
I mean, some people, maybe, sure.
Okay, yes, if you have a lot of money and you think it would be cool to have a high-speed camera, go nuts. This is a pretty good option from our experience for $5,000. But most of the uses of this particular camera, especially, are going to be people in labs and research endeavors that need to capture things that happen faster than they can see.
Or dudes who just want to detonate airbags in their backyards.
We just borrowed this one, just to be clear.
And so I think the big takeaway is that understanding what frame rate things are good at. Yeah. And finding where these sweet spots of frame rates are at.
This gives you, spending time with this gives you a really good appreciation for how fast or how slow 4,000th of a second is, which is what you capture with the iPhone, basically.
Right. And to sum it up, I would say that under 240 FPS, which is like your GoPro and your iPhones, it's good for action. And above that, when you're talking about the 700 FPS up to many thousands FPS, that's good for reactions.
Explain.
Actions and things that are reactions that are happening. And right now, and as time goes by, as we get faster processors, as sensors get cheaper, I can expect that we're going to see consumer products move into that capturing reactions territory.
When you look at a 4K camera in a phone, which was just announced earlier this week in Barcelona, we're going to see a lot more 4K sensors. As the sensors get bigger, we're going to see more faster, better, high speed. So this is just really the beginning for consumer high speed. And that's what we know. For Tested, I'm Will.
I'm Norm.
We'll see you guys later.
Bye.